Thank you, Tim. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you for the organizer, Wendy, and Adrian for inviting me. Although it's a brave act to ask an engineer to give a keynote speech in a public health conference, but I'll do my best. So, I can't see my own lecture. It's an engineering problem. So, I thought I'd give a little twist to the presentation, just to, we have some fun. I'm not going to ask you to stand up every 5 minutes, unfortunately, but I will. Is that a chair? But I will play with the title a bit. So I was given a talk, there were some rejected titles, which I won't share the names of, but I chose to sort of think about the measuring physical activity and sedentary behavior in the sort of the childhood tales we always heard about, the hare and the tortoise. I'll let you decide which the hare is and which is the tortoise. Obviously, we always heard that the hare perhaps stands for physical activity or moderate vigorous activity because it's a little faster by nature, and the tortoise, obviously, is the other spectrum. And the race starts, and the hare jumps out, and the tortoise sort of just pug along. Well, it's gone already. And then essentially won the race. So it reminds me of the struggle, the duel that we have now, is which one is more important? Which one actually win the race and determine health consequences. But in order to really question that, from my perspective, it starts out how you measure. How do you measure the moderate vigorous, or how do you measure sedentary aspect of things? So I want to give a little bit of background of the activity monitoring. So you'll notice that I combine all of them together. And of course, I'm an engineer. I'll give you some aspects of the basic properties of a sensor, what makes a sensor, and I'll give you my perspective with bias, the evolution of data processing and analysis. And we'll summarize it and discuss in the future directions. So just to be fair, the race starts back again, and guess who's going to win this time? I don't know, it's random. Oh, the hare one, okay. So, the mouse is a little slow. Maybe I just not pressing hard enough. Okay, here we go. So as I was preparing this talk a few weeks ago, my graduate student actually found this paper with some of the authors in the room, sort of looking at the methods of measurement epidemiology, but particularly focused on the sedentary behavior. This is published in the International Journal of Epidemiology about a month ago, I think. Where they sort of observed and summarized a lot of papers in the field currently and make some observational conclusions based on the different types of measurements. So the subjective assessments, and these are activity records or surveys or diary and whatnot, and ask you, some of you probably use some similar type of assessment tools. Basically, let me summarize the pros and cons of this measure, this type of measurement. And obviously you can apply it to large-scale applications, assess behavior, and it's relatively low cost and with moderate validity. Whereas the limitation aspect of it, it's by subject nature, it's biased. To some degree, it's inaccurate in specific activities. They do have the subject burden problem, and at least the US subjects don't really like to write down anything. Processing time is another issue, so you go really with a pencil and paper method. And they're objective monitors, and it won't fit all in the screen, but essentially these are your typical objective measurements that we see in the field in the last several years. I can't include all of the measurements. Do I have a pointer? So, the idea monitor, which I'll show you a little bit more details. These are wired sensors, and here's a pedometer, but based on accelerometry. ActiHeart, ActiPow, ActiCal, ActiWatches, and the Dynaboard. Actigo, I have different versions of it. Genie Active, the newest version. The SenseWear armband and the McRoberts, which some people have used them. So these are some common research tools. Obviously, I can't include all of them, but the general concepts are that they have is just almost the opposite of the pros and cons of the subject measurements. These are unbiased objective measurements. They're continuous measurement, most of it, and they actually give you time-stamped activities. Typically, they're seen as a low subject burden. You wear and perhaps forget. They give good validity, especially when you compare some criterion measures, which I'll go through details. Typical limitations, they do tend to be costly, although if they're reused or used repeatedly, it does sometimes evens out. Researcher burden, so in fact you have to program and download and process it. And some are involved in complex modeling, and they are limited to measure a lot of behaviors, but some behaviors you can't measure that using objective monitors. So now here comes my perspective as an engineer. I know there are several fellow engineers in the room, although you probably don't want to identify yourselves. We need good sensors. Nothing starts with a bad sensor. As we say, garbage in, garbage out. So if you got to select the right sensor for your application. And the other thing, just follow Dr. Toronto's last talk, if you were in that room, we need good reference data. So this is a pet peeve of mine, that we really want to focus on a good measurement for the reference or criterion measure if you want to develop the sensor to assess that aspect of things. Then you can think about the appropriate models, that building a bridge between the sensor data and the reference data. And then you need to improve that each step and rerun the process, repeat, redesign, revalidate. So this is not a one-step finish and you're done. It's actually a repeated, iterative steps. And you need to simplify it and let others test. I know I'm an engineer, I tend to make things a little bit more complicated, although conceptually you need to make it very simple so others can understand and test. That's an engineer's model. You know, all in God we trust, all others bring data. You gotta have good data to start with everything. So, as Tim said, I focused my efforts, and when I first started my PhD, is measuring energy expenditure. So measuring activity was essentially not a secondary sort of adaptation, but really for me to start measuring activity is to enhance our ability to measure energy expenditure or activity energy expenditure. So as we think about measuring energy expenditure, you can measure very short term or very long term, from the left to the right. You know, you can measure the resting components. I can't emphasize enough, if you want to do modeling aspect of things, your resting energy expenditure model measurement can be very, very important. It can screw everything up if you don't measure it or if you use the wrong predictive equation for that. And then you can measure sort of an intermediate step, you know, a couple of hours of physical activity by portable accelerometer. This is a Jaeger system. You have COSMEDs. But nevertheless, you measure the sort of take it to go method. You measure energy expenditure while you're on the move. And you have sort of the intermediate step, which I focus a lot of my efforts in. This is one of the metabolic chambers I built at the NIH. There are 30 semi-metabolic chambers around the world that you can get a 24-hour measurement, not just the total, but the dynamic range from sleeping all the way to activity. See that treadmill in there, you can actually do some activity. You can replace it with a bike. Obviously, you can't play tennis in there, but I have people practicing their taekwondo or karate in there. So it does have a little bit more dynamic range to it. And once you develop the model, and this is the key, sometimes people develop a model with double-labeled water. I wouldn't recommend it. I think double-labeled water is a very good tool to actually validate once you have a model that you develop, either from a portable calorimeter or a room calorimeter. So this is how I visualize the measurement aspect, the span of energy expenditure. So we were essentially motivated by the earlier clue to accelerometer's potential in physical activity monitoring. So Ed Melanson from Patty Friesen's lab at the time, Ed's now in Colorado, essentially showed that if you plot out minute by minute energy expenditure, this is expressed in minutes and different people, against the first generation of CSA monitors. Remember, this is a 1995 paper. These are counts per minute. And you have a general sort of a relationship, correlation of R square of 0.7 or so. So it's not too bad, in fact. And this is basically on the treadmill, because it's actually your best case scenario. But nevertheless, gave us a clue that we can actually do some modeling. So, seeing that, the first paper what I saw was that how does it really work? How does the accelerometer work? And can we really sort of develop a model that span the whole range? Use a simplified approach. So obviously regression has a lot of people interested in doing that still. And let's just speak briefly, how does it work? Because I'm an engineer, I have to show you what the inside of a sensor looks like. Typically, how many of you have opened up an accelerometer? All right, a couple of hands goes up. All right, so what you see inside is that everything starts with a sensor. What is a sensor, or a transducer as we call it? It's an energy converter. So when you move around, you convert that energy to electrical signals. And how does that work? I'll show you later. But it's guided by the sensor itself. It's got its properties. It's got its range. You can only detect a certain gravitational constant range. Its sensitivity means that there are certain small movements you may not be able to detect. Linearity, how linear is the system? Signal with your electronic signal, is it really associated with your movement? It has other properties that most people don't think about, such as hysteresis. When it goes up in a high acceleration, how fast does it come down? All sensors have these problems of hysteresis, and sometimes comes back a little slower, and drifts over time or different temperatures. Does it really drift? Okay, so these are the questions that only an engineer would ask, probably. And once you have a good sensor, or a sensor, and it may not be a good sensor, how does that really get the data? So this is done by a data acquisition system, and it's really a sampler. It tells the sensor, when do I need to grab that data, and how often do I need to grab that data? And then it goes into a microcomputer, this is the black box, and you condition the signal, and you process the signal. And then I'll go through each step very briefly with you. Okay, I promise it's the last animation slide that I have. But so you'll see a subject walking, and typically if we put the sensors on the hip, you'll see that this is a static line. It does change around that, and if you measure the displacement over time of that hip sensor, you have almost a sinusoid wave. In a biomechanics view, actually, there's probably not an exact sinusoid, but let's just simplify it. That's called a sinusoidal wave. And that sinusoid can be measured by, this is a old cantilever setup, or a traditional cantilever setup. If you design a piezoelectric element, which essentially in some of your watches and whatnot, every time it bends with a mass, so acceleration, for example, mimic of what this person's moving, and when it bends, actually, it gives that electrical signal. And that's exactly what we measure. And that's what gets extracted into a data acquisition system and gets stored. And the rest of it is really simple engineering. So this is actual picture of a cantilever beam. It's used in earlier versions of actigraph and other accelerometers. This is an actual loading plate, and instead of using a beam, a plate can be also used to put a mass on top of it, and the compression of that can be registered as a signal, electronic signal. These were reviewed in our earlier paper in Medicine Science and Sports and Exercise at 2005, and these, previous to that time, they were individually assembled, so they are quite expensive, and there's some problems with the between monitor variabilities. By a couple of years ago, 2008, 2009, perhaps guided or encouraged by the development of accelerometers and cell phones and the Wii, people start using a capacitant-based accelerometer, or mass-produced. So, and these are microchips now. You can buy $5, $6, and they're sensitive to gravitational constant. How does that really work? Well, it's a simple structure that's a microstructure. This is a call a schematic of it. So you have a mass in the middle of a microchip, and if you were to use spring or a waffle cone type of things, and you can view the distance between the bottom plate and the structure box as a capacitor. As you imagine this moving up and down, the capacitance changes. It's associated with the distance of the plates. So this is a very innovative way to do it. And another advantage is actually at rest, you can actually have a static signal. So from a gravitational constant perspective, this works really well. So this is the only circuit diagram I'll show you. I won't quiz you on it, but essentially if you put a voltage on it and you can amplify it, and it gives you a nice signal. And this is how the signal gets processed. So if you give similar to sinusoid, this is actually a walking signal, you'll get a close to a sinusoid raw wave collected at 40 hertz. And you'll see some of these jagged edges and whatnot, whether it's a signal or noise. It depends on translation. And then you can filter. Typically, what you get used to get, is that you filter the signal with a bandwidth filter or low pass filter, is that you get rid of some of these noise, jagged edges, and you get a pretty smooth signal. And then typically, before you average it, the signal, because if you average the signal, guess what you're going to get? Zeros. So you actually turn this, all the negative side to the positive side. It's called rectification. You full wave rectify it, and then you integrate all these sort of the peaks together. So you double the peak numbers right here. And then you sum it over epoch, whether it be 1 second, 1 minute. So that becomes the counts, okay? The problem is, everybody does a little bit differently. So the counts may not translate from one accelerometer type to another. Sometimes even the same generation or same accelerometer type, different generation, give you slight different numbers. Because they may choose a different sensor, they may use a slight different filter, and this process is usually the same, and then the counts will be slightly different. So that's a problem. So this step, other than the signal itself from the sensor, is all done in the data acquisition system, analysis system. So that's pretty much hardcore engineering. I apologize for that if I lost you, fell asleep, I understand. Okay, so the question is, what does it really mean? Can we really turn that signal into health-related outcomes that we are interested? So we started to work on with this system ever since I've read that paper by Mullins and Friesen, essentially to think, how do we model these signals? Can we use that to measure energy expenditure or estimate energy expenditure? And then if you do that well, as Ken Powell yesterday said very well, it's sort of a continuous spectrum. You look at the intensity activity, whether by METs or by total energy expenditure, then you can really, to get other outcomes perhaps, like wear time, sleep, qualities, and everything else. But the energy expenditure is where we start to parse apart whether it's sedentary, light, moderate, vigorous, or anything in between. So this is my bias, and this is my focus started with. So simply, when you do exploratory analysis, you plot everything against each other. So this is a time plot of 3 different sensors, the ActiCal, the ActiGraph, this is a GT1N monitor, and the RT3, which is a triaxial accelerometer, this is vector magnitude, against everything on the energy expenditure side is measured minute by minute in the Medlock chamber. And these are the ActiCal counts, ActiGraph counts, and RT3 counts. You'll see when we ask the subject doing specific activities, these are walking around, jogging on the end, and doing other step activities. You see the signal energy expenditure in kcals per minute are pretty substantial in 10 minutes and rest 5 to 10 minutes. You have these really nice dynamic signals. And there are some activities in the afternoon are fairly sedentary. And these are all hip-worn in the same spot. You'll see generally they're pretty well agreed to each other. And so the motivation is to apply simple one-to-one regression models. You can do it linearly, like a lot of people have done. You can do it bilinearly. Dan Ha's model I'll show you with the ActiCal. It's count-based. Under a threshold, it chooses one linear regression, and above a certain threshold, it uses another linear regression. Note that these two lines actually don't cross. Or you can take an approach that we had done previously in 97, 98. You do sort of a continuous power model. So the question is, how do they work and how do they compare to each other? So Megan Rothney, a PhD student in my lab at the time, published this paper in 2008, I think, in Journal Obesity, compared the two different models by Dan Heil, the active cow. Essentially, as I said, you count a certain range uses a one regression versus the other count above certain threshold. These are modeled activity energy expenditure in kcals per minute. Or you can use a continuous linear model. This is the Friesen work energy theorem, essentially. And again, you could do sort of a count-based cut point and different regressions. Or you can use Henneman's model with the METs. There's another model with the active graph. Again, a simple baseline and a slope. And RT3 has a proprietary model, and we have developed a non-linear regression model, essentially. And Henneman also, the same paper, had an RT3 model. So how do they compare to each other against the criterion measure in the metabolic chamber? So this was our primary objective in this paper. So we've taken our approach. You'll see the later studies are all pretty much the same. We like to study a cross-sectional sample of pretty wide range, both in terms of height, weight, and percent body fat as measured by DEXA. And this is what we call a heterogeneous population. Each one stayed at 24 hours in the metabolic chamber, where we measured minute-by-minute energy expenditure and put accelerometers on them. And this is what sometimes we call a Christmas tree project. They have ornaments all over their bodies. And then we can actually tease out, using those models that I've shown you before, ActiCal 1, 2, and ActiCal 1, 2, 3, RT3, so on and so forth. You can have the indirect calorimeter, or the chamber measurement, as 80% of the day or non-sleeping time was spent in the sedentary. It's between 1 and 1.5 METs. And so on and so forth, where the percent is spent in light, moderate, and vigorous. So this is the criterion measure, the bold black. And then the other models are compared to that. Anything you see as stars is statistically different than the criterion measure. I'll highlight a couple things that they did pretty well. You see the active graph, the third model, which they did quite well in terms of percent day of the moderate activity. And the RT3 model, not to blow our own horns, did very well in both the sedentary, the percent light, and the percent vigorous. And but what's wrong with this one? Essentially there's no sedentary component at all. So if you have a sharp eye, you'll see that these models are given the total power levels, so physical activity levels, total energy expenditure divided by the resting. And the difference between that and measured, which is 1.4. Again, as I said, in the chamber, you can't do all the activities you typically do. So the overall power level was 1.4. The best was RT3, the third model, essentially looking at pretty decently, 1.37. The worst is this model right here. And why is that? You remember that the constant, or the y-intercept, is 2.9. These are in METs. So this model, if you want to do sedentary activity, would you choose this model? Probably not, because you're going to get zeros. So we have a follow-up study, and Josh Worland back at Vanderbilt had published recently in MSSC a paper to look at different childhood models with ActiCal, ActiGraph, and RT3. RT3 is only one model that we know of that essentially being published. It's similar to the sort of the power level spread, so you can take a look at that. But the principle is the same. This is when we validate the existing models, simple regression models, against a criterion measure that we have a lot of faith in, because we actually do a lot of calibrations with the chamber. We know that measurement is solid. Not only is accurate, but it's also very sensitive. So I want to show you a proof of concept that we started doing. So not that we got tired of the one-to-one regression approach, but started 2000s, we start getting a little greedy. Okay, engineers have a tendency to do that. We can actually start measuring raw data at that time. And our question is, can we actually squeeze that raw data and get some features from that, and perhaps that can improve our accuracy and precision of predicting energy expenditure. And we chose to measure and predict continuous activity and energy expenditure. Sometimes we call it EE-ACT. This is work before I came to NIH in 2006, and done from 2000 and 2006. So, and you may be aware that there's a device called IDEA, it's an intelligent device of energy expenditure and activity. In 2004, John et al. Published a paper showing that you can use the system, which consists of 5 wired accelerometers. And again, this is proof of concept at the time. 2 placed at the top of the thigh, 2 placed at the bottom of the feet, which I can tell you, not very comfortable if you wear it for more than a couple of hours and walking. And may encourage your sedentary behavior, because sitting down feels pretty good. And one at the sternum, which is measured the posture, the combination of the sternum measurement and the thigh measurement, and from which they use a collected 32 hertz. They can actually detect up to about 80 activity types, different types of sitting across your leg over the right leg over left and whatnot. And it's been validated using direct observation that these are highly accurate. And from the posture and activity type information, it uses a lookup table, essentially use a compendium of activity and do a predictive energy expenditure. So what we did in the early 2000s is asked the company to actually add a sensor in the portable unit that does the data recording right at the hip. Our questions is such: can we actually extract the raw data and to do a better model? Because we have a very good criterion measure. So we then chose a different approach. We chose to use a neural network approach. Well, how does that come about? I have been asked, how does it really work? Because in most papers we write, there's not much details on how does it really work. So I want to use this opportunity to show you how it works. As we all know in your biology courses, that our neurons are not static. It doesn't just take in a signal and gives out another one. It's adaptive. It learns by itself by training. So this is a typical neuron. And you've got your dendrites, except the neurotransmitters through the synapses from another neuron, and then it processes it and then pass that signal down to another level. So this is the cell body that integrates a lot of inputs. You see there's a lot of gap junctions, a lot of synapses, and it actually evaluates the importance of these inputs and assign these weights. Sometimes you can visibly see that some of the synapses and gap junctions are a lot thicker, presumably they're a little bit more important, and versus others that essentially, if this one's not important, let's just shorten that or don't really need that. So this is a biological concept, and it does this by sort of iteratively learn by what's important and assign its weight. So we can actually model that mathematically. So this is a single artificial neuron. You have these input signals. Let's presume these are what we gather or collected of accelerometer. These are the weights that we assign. And you integrate that signal and apply it to some kind of transfer function. This is when you allow flexibility. It's a linear or non-linear. And then you get an output. Okay, this is a single pass. And the output can be your activity and energy expenditure in absolute numbers, or med levels, or physical activity types, etc. Whatever you want, okay? Whatever you assign to, as long as you have a good criterion measure. All right, so how do you build a network? It's this artificial neural network now. So each one of this is a single neuron, and you can actually have the input layer and have a hidden layer to just expand the complexity a little bit. And then you have the outputs. This is a typical setup, and everything in between are these weights that can be adjusted. So, how do you arrive at a decision when you have such a complex network? Well, this is a very traditional feed-forward feedback propagation. Okay, a mouthful, but it's a very simple concept. So first, you get your input. Whoops. And the inputs are your different characteristics or patterns of your input signal, which in this case, accelerometer signal. And then you assign random weights. These are random. And then you, again, assign one random weights on this layer and get past these flexible and hidden neurons. And you get sort of your first round of predictive energy expenditure. Most time, because they are random assigned weights, they're widely off. Okay? Then you compare that with the measured energy expenditure. And that error between the two gets passed backwards. That's what backward propagation means. And using the direction of that error, you reassign the weights. So that's exactly how the process works. Well, why do you use such a process? It looks really complicated. Well, when you try to do this as a proof of concept, by no means I'm suggesting this is your final model, you have a large number of candidates of input dimension. You really don't know what you need, don't know how to use it. So if you collected data at 32 hertz, you've got 1,920 samples per minute mapped to one energy expenditure value per minute. And we chose not to have a lot of a priori specification of how we want to model this. So you need really a flexible model that trains itself. Designing study, we decided not to go very homogeneous type of activities or using one sedentary or one active. We actually fill this time frame with a lot of activities. They come in the chamber at about 8 o'clock, and we'll put physical activity monitors on them all, like a Christmas tree, hang all of them. And then between 9:30 and 12 o'clock, they have a lot of activities that span the light, moderate, and vigorous spectrum. They're stretching, pacing in the room, walking around. They have jogs. They have walking at different speeds, jog at different speeds. In the afternoon, they're typing, they're handwriting, playing cards, biking, sweeping on the floor. The chamber does need to be cleaned, so they're doing that. And by all means, they have quite a few hours at other time doing spontaneous activity. When we say spontaneous, mostly they're fairly sedentary. And then they go to bed, and we get a really robust measurement of resting energy expenditure in the morning, and they finish. So this is a subject we tested, 102 subjects. Again, very heterogeneous. Percent body fat vary from 6.2 to 57% as measured by DEXA. So a lot of subjects. For this type of study, it took us 2.5 years to collect these many subjects, one at a time in one chamber. And first we have to synchronize the data. Because they run in different computers. 32 hertz accelerometer data, and then you can actually synchronize with the metabolic chamber. Then you compare the signal characteristics from each minute segment and compare that to energy expenditure and compare that to the accelerometer. And the first thing we have to do, and this is actually 90% of the work, is on this page. You process the data, and you have to reduce that signal from 1,920 per minute to some characteristic you can truly handle, because we really don't have, at the time, we don't have a supercomputer that can run this analysis. The analysis actually took us probably a couple of days to just have a computer run. So this is for raw accelerometer matched by synchronized with energy expenditure. Again, minute by minute energy expenditure of one subject. And these are different activities, and there's some activities in the afternoon, as I showed you. And there's some spontaneous, light, and sedentary activities. And these what the anterior-posterior hip acceleration looks like. We actually had biaxial at the time, so you have a vertical and an anterior-posterior. So, and these are raw data. You'll see that there's some gravitational components to it, and there's some negative and positive components to it. So from which, we started with about 40 or 50 statistically representative features per axis per minute, such as median, peak, interquartile interval skewness, kurtosis, coefficient of variance, power spectrum density, essentially looking at the variability measures. And after you adjust for the collinearity between these measures, and we selected 5 features, peak, the interquartile intervals, coefficient of variance, and 2 components in the power spectrum density. So there are 10 parameters from the raw data. And this is what some of what it looks like. And it's a focused version of about 350 minutes now. You'll see this the sum of the power spectrum density. They correlate quite well with the energy expenditure. Coefficient variance, you get a lot more the high frequency or the peak, the dynamic signal than, say, for example, compared to power spectrum density. Interquartile interval gives you a different feature. So these features are not exactly correlated to each other, but they give it a different taste, if you will, to the perhaps the model of energy expenditure. So again, I don't want to go through the super details with you, but we did, after quite a few debate between Megan and I, we decided to actually include some subject characteristic into the model. I remind you, because we measure, we're predicting that the absolute energy expenditure of physical activity here, so kcals per minute. So we included these subject characteristics, and we decided rather than have a totally free transfer function, we did want to apply, given our previous experience, a nonlinear hyperbolic tangent, so if transfer function allow the nonlinear components to it, and at the last step between the hidden layer and the output layer, because we think that negative energy expenditure means nothing, so we actually force all the energy expenditure to be positive. And we use a gradient descent optimization, which I'll show you. And another important thing, we don't fit the model. We don't only fit the model, we actually do a validation process by leave one out. So how does that really work? So leave one out method is that, remember we have 102 subjects. We use 101 as the training data set to train the model. And when they converge, and how does it converge, I'll show you. And then we apply the parameters, and these are weights, to the other subject. So this subject data is entirely independent of these set. So there's a validation set. And repeat the process 102 times. Okay, so that's why it took the computer a couple of days to run the model. And as I showed you before, when you start the model, these are the mean square error. So essentially, we choose to optimize the model, or least square fit, if you will. It gets very high to begin with. Okay, so this is thousands of iterations, 2,000. That's what we sort of gated or decided 2,000 is pretty good. When you start out, the error is quite high, but it converges pretty quickly. And by the time you run about 500 at 1,000 iterations, it gets pretty stable. Okay, this is what a convergence of an error parameter looks like. If it stays up, you know you chose the wrong model. You got to fix that. So what's the performance look like? Okay, so this is one individual data randomly selected. The blue line is measured, the red line is the accelerometer, so this is the reference measure, energy expenditure, and the blue line is predicted, and we chose to use the Friesens 99 model. You see that some underestimation of certain activities, particularly the sedentary sides, and also on some of the jogging activities as well. This is the idea monitor. 5 sensors, 10 channels, using the lookup model, and some overestimations, obviously. And this is how we did a cross-validate using the other 101 subjects to run the model. You see that fitting is quite well. Okay, this is one subject, and this is randomly chosen. How does it do overall? So we use a couple of error parameters to guide us. R squared, between just minute by minute R squared, each individual. This is a validation of the actigraph model, idea model. This is the artificial neural network model. The R square is improving, although R square wasn't too bad to begin with these models. The mean absolute error and mean square error, you see essentially gradually they're reducing, showing that the less the error, obviously the better. And the percent difference in total energy expenditure is predicting. Also, with the actigraph, you're about 20% off. Idea, you're about 12% off. When it comes to ANN, not too bad. These are absolute difference in total energy expenditure. Another way to show it is a Bland-Ullmann plot. The actigraph on one axis, and you essentially, as I've showed you before, the predicted energy expenditure, total energy expenditure is off by 300 kcals or so. And pretty wide confidence interval, 95% confidence interval. With the idea monitor, the prediction is sort of upshifted, a little bit better of a confidence interval, and an overestimation in this case by 250 kcoms per day. And this is our model that using a one biaxial hip accelerometer. This is not fitting. This is individual prediction. Again, I remind you, it did quite well, both in terms of average energy expenditure as well as the confidence interval. So this hopefully convinced you that this is a successful proof of concept, that not just the 1 minute epoch average counts, but using the features of the raw accelerometer at the hip, it can predict energy expenditure of activity. And I've shown you here is actually a span, entire span. The R-squared, the mean absolute error, shows that it can predict both the sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous, this whole span of activities. So there are similar amount of work. We're not the only people who do this. Patty Friedson and John Steinmeier's group in Massachusetts have done some work, but their focus has been on modeling steady state energy expenditure, whereas we monitor the entire span and transitions and everything in between. We don't like to miss any data. And then really they started to model the steady state energy expenditure activity types and do quite well. Stuart Trust, I think, is in the audience, done a similar approach with children. I think he's also presenting this afternoon. Scott Crowder actually took a very simple approach, very nice and simple approach. Remember I talked about simplifying the process? He just looked at the coefficient of variance within each time period, at 10 seconds or so, and categorized the physical activity, whether using a different regression, sort of a power model above 1 or below 1. Actually does quite well as well. Now, the average energy expenditure, as we validated his model, are pretty close to the measure by the chamber. The individual variability is still a bit high. Okay? And John and all with Alex have done very recently using a risk model. This is very innovative. That show that the neural network approach does work quite well. So there's actually a recent review paper I must mention if you're interested in this area. I do encourage you to look at the review paper by Lil and all. Robert Gallows, I think is from Patty Friedson's group, the corresponding author. Sort of review the computational methods and parameters that you might want to consider use for this predicting energy expenditure. So let's review what we've proved. Okay, so this is what we had before, sort of minute by minute counts. You know, you have some general trends of activity during the day, and this is a pretty pixelated picture. All right, some of you know what it is, but you can't really tell by this kind of approach what kind of activity is this or what kind of picture is this. If you have second by second measurement, you have a little bit better of image, okay? So I guess when we developed digital cameras, when we started about right here, and we improved the megapixels, if you will, you get a little bit better picture, and you start guessing what this picture is really about. So when you have the raw data now, it's 30, 32 hertz, 80 hertz, whatever, you'll see this is a picture close to where I live, Washington, D.C. in the springtime, cherry blossom, Jefferson Memorial in the background. This is great. What else can we do? Well, again, did I tell you I'm greedy? Yeah. So once you have this picture, and then you can actually have a better analysis of it, but what if we add color to it? All right, so if you have triaxial data, and this is vertical, we got anterior, posterior, lateral, you can actually add several dimensions to it. And this is the exact work that's going on now in the field. You have triaxial accelerometer, you have raw data, and you've got to make some pictures out of it. So before 2009, we were sort of stuck. Some people still are stuck in the count-based devices. And the pros and cons are listed here. They're small, they're portable, they're rugged, they're fairly inexpensive, a couple $100. You know, they give you a robust 7 days of data on minute-by-minute resolution. They're reproducible within monitors. And there are differences between monitors, and that's part of the limitations. And obviously, they're varied response with different activities. And the by and large, hopefully I've shown you, they're fairly imprecise in terms of predicted energy expenditure. So now we have a pretty revolutionary upgrade in 2000 or so. This is comparing the old accelerometer 7164s to 256. The only difference between the two monitors, the memory expanded, and the GT3X monitor, GT1M, I'm sorry, and the 3X. 1M stands for 1 megabyte of memory. Wow, 1 megabyte. What are you going to do with that? And these are essentially uniaxial, collected 10 hertz, and these are the bandwidth filters. Although they tell you sometimes 0.25, what we measure is around 0.5 cutoff frequency. And once you have the 1M or 1 megabytes or 4 megabytes, you can actually do a little bit more. So a lot of our raw data is actually collected at that time for a short period. And all of a sudden, in 2010, you have these two raw data accelerometers, GT3X Plus and Genie Active. And they really expand the memory size without really increasing the size themselves. Both of them are triaxial accelerometers. In our hands, they're very comparable in terms of measuring the accelerations. And it actually gives you a wide range of sampling rate. You can choose 10 hertz to 100 hertz. Okay, so, and as a raw accelerometer, it doesn't really have a bandwidth filter to mess up with the raw signals. Okay, so the pros and cons, you see that expanded the fact that they are small, still rugged. In fact, both these two are water splash proof or waterproof. And they will actually collect 28 days of continuous data. And that's really a nice thing. And the reproducibility is increased because they're massively produced or quantitatively produced, so they're really not hand-soldered accelerometer now. They have absolute unfiltered, unified data units or gravitational constants between monitors. And they are improved energy expenditure predictions, as I've shown you, but it's not perfect. Okay, they're still restricted to certain activity types that you can't measure very well. Rick had gone through this slide, and I just recognized because this sort of guides me, not just because there's an engineer in here, but it really, we need to interest different fields, bringing people that really know how to model this. A few days ago, I spoke to a speech or language recognition expert. So people are really interested in applying different approaches, as we did, bringing in a neural network approach. But that's so yesterday. There are much better methods today. So then we can really address the question, is it wrist or ankle? Well, I don't know. Is it wrist or ankle? What do you think? Or back or head. I remember Stewart in 2004 showed a picture. He wore an accelerometer on top of the head. Well, people actually listened to him. Put an accelerometer on the head of a seal or sea lion, and this is a little animal headed on the back. So people are actually using this, whether we agree it or not. They are measuring both activity in the people and in the animals. So, summarize everything. I hope I've convinced you that accelerometer-based monitors allow objective measurement in most activities in the free living, and if you don't know that already. But the development of sensor and software need to be based on accurate and sensitive estimation of the health outcomes. In my case, it was energy expenditure. In yours, might be slightly different. But nevertheless, you got to make sure you have a good criterion measure before you start modeling. Otherwise, that's why you get inaccuracy. And I must stress, as Kim Powell tell you before, activity, sedentary behavior are components of a continuous spectrum. Don't throw away a lot of other things just because you want to measure thin A and not really consider A to Z. So in my sense, Hare or the tortoise, who's going down? Really, I think it's one of the same thing, don't you think? It's the whole spectrum that we're thinking about. Okay, I want to acknowledge most people that have done the work. Megan Rothney, my PhD student and postdoc, now has moved on to better things. Rob Brichta is the postdoc still with me, and here are the people that used to work for me at Vanderbilt and at the NIH now, and the students who left the lab. And these are my collaborators and colleagues that actually motivate me to continue to do the work in this area. And I want to thank you for being here.